No matter how long God calls me to be a pastor, I will never cease to be amazed at how he works things to perfectly fall into place. We've been working through the highlights of the life of David, and it just so happens that what we'll look at today fits the theme of this service very well. Having an outdoor service, having a church picnic and fellowship, and all those kind of things. As we get into the message this morning, I will make that much more clear to you, but first things first, we have to start somewhere. So we'll pick it up where we left off last time, where David had his third encounter with King Saul. As I said last week, it was this cat and mouse game that was developing. It was getting really old. I'm sure David was tired of having to run around and avoid being caught, all those kind of things. And I know if I were David, I wouldn't want to have to sleep with one eye open, as they say, either, wondering if today is the day, that your life is going to be in danger. So let's settle in this morning, because we are going to look at 4 chapters of the story. Now, we're not going to read all 4 chapters, okay? I'm waiting for the groans. But we're going to read parts of 4, because this section of the Bible is so closely related, and I think it gives us a good overview of what's going on at this specific time, and it shows us how one decision by David generates an awful lot of fallout that he couldn't even have imagined. So I want to start in 1 Samuel 27 and just read verses 1 and 2 there. But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. Now we'll move to chapter 28, just the first 2 verses there. In those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." David said, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." Achish replied, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Now if we move to verse 29, the first 7 verses here, the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching in the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with him and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assign him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands?" So Achish called David to him and said, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in my army. From the day you came to me until now, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." Then finally we move to chapter 30 and verses 1 through 6. It is on this page. David said, David and his men reached Ziklag on the 3rd day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had only taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. In the preceding chapters, we admired David because he was following God, and he didn't give in to any of the peer pressure to kill King Saul. 2 times, by the way, despite everything that he stood to gain by doing so. It would have made their lives an awful lot easier. But the Christian journey is now taking its toll on David. Would you agree that being a Christian sometimes takes a toll on you? It's not the best slogan to use to get someone to become a Christian. Say, hey, become a Christian, your life's going to get a lot harder. You know, we don't put it in those terms, but maybe we should. Even though David is a man after God's own heart, we can't lose sight of the fact David is a fallible man. He makes mistakes, and he still sins. Just as we get scared, David got scared too. He evaded Saul once again, but how many times is he going to put his life on the line? Simply put, he became discouraged, and he got tired of trusting God. With that as the background, this is really a one-point message this morning, but the one point has many, many applications to it. The point is, David acted rashly out of fear, and fear is the opposite of trusting God. When you're scared, it seems like you will do just about anything to be safe, so David hightailed it out of town in a hurry. Hello. By this time, David was married to 2 different women, still leading 600 men, and they all settled in this town of Ziklag, among the Philistines, by the way, who were Israel's enemies. Sort of think of it like a big commune from the 1960s, minus the music and sort of the extracurricular stuff that goes on there. But many of David's 600 men had settled down, and they had wives, they had children of their own, and it's safe to say there probably could have been close, if not more than 2,000 people here that David was leading, and they're depending on him. It's not a good situation for David to go off the grid, as they say. He basically thought, I'm not getting the results here that I want, so I'm out of here. Again, this is all brought on because he's very discouraged and brought on by fear. Now, think forward to the New Testament for a minute. Can you think of a person who left everything he had for selfish reasons? Anyone want to take a guess who I'm thinking? Maybe there's more than one guess here, but I'll tell you. I'm thinking of the prodigal son, okay? We call him prodigal, which the word means he was wasteful, but I think it's really better to call him the lost son, because David is very lost. If I had the screen right now that we have inside, I would show you a map of the area, and a very simple map, show you how David started down south in the land of Ziph, and then he moved northwest. For you, it would be this way, up to Gath, and then he would travel northeast up to the battle, and then when he's done, they send him home. He travels back down south where he came from. So his path really looked like an elongated circle. In a literal sense, David was leading his people in a big circle because he didn't know what to do. He was so lost. He was lost like the prodigal son. And the thing about him is that a lot of times we can look at the prodigal son in more than one way. One way is a person who is lost in the beginning. He leaves, he comes to faith during the difficult time while he's wandering around. That's one way to look at him. But the prodigal son can also be a story of a person who is a believer in the beginning, leaves everything behind temporarily, still clings to his faith, tenuous as it is, that he had all along, and then comes back. That person is sort of the mold of David, that second example. He had faith in the beginning, he just gave in to fear and went off on his own. David's really the Old Testament version of the prodigal son. Now, when people backslide, as David did, oftentimes you have to hit rock bottom in order to realize the depths from which you've fallen. For some people, it takes a divorce and you lose your spouse to realize how bad things have gotten. While other people, maybe they have to wind up in prison or rehab, something like that. Luke 15 says of the prodigal son, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. And then we come to what I think is one of the saddest clauses in the whole Bible. But no one gave him anything. Just think, even with 300 fighting men around him, none of them made any significant effort to stop David from making a big mistake. You see, we oftentimes want to help people no matter what, especially if they're family members or close friends. But what oftentimes happens is by doing so, we enable the bad behavior. By giving them what they need or what they want. Just today, I'll help you out. Or maybe even worse, they passively sit back and don't encourage them to even do the right thing. People don't realize that if that person doesn't hit rock bottom, they're not going to turn their life around. Then you may have to do the hard thing, and that is not help them. You may be helping them more by not helping, if that makes any sense. That way, they will hit rock bottom sooner rather than later. You won't prolong a bad situation. And oftentimes, people don't want to learn if they are constantly being bailed out. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to not help a person so that they will grow up and become responsible. Now, as far as the prodigal son's concerned, Luke 15 says, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. What happens sometimes is a person just gets tired of the way things are going. They leave their church, they leave their friends, they may even leave their family, and they go into isolation. That's, in a sense, although he had people there, David was isolated. Why did he do this? I suspect because at this time in his life, David didn't have spiritual guidance. The Bible tells us on 2 different occasions the prophet Samuel had died. I think that's for a reason, to emphasize the fact that David wasn't being fed, in a manner of speaking. Started him on a downward spiral. Probably a big reason why he made poor decisions, putting many people at risk. That's why we need to keep going to church, keep reading our Bibles, keep praying, keep growing, keep studying, all those kind of things with other believers to build each other up. Doesn't seem like a big deal if you sleep in and miss church just this week, but things tend to snowball, don't they? And before you know it, just like David, you find yourself more comfortable among the pagans than you do God's own people. Which leads to a very interesting dynamic in the story, which is that even though David didn't have good spiritual leading, God used what was there to get his attention. What I mean here is David was getting in really good with Achish, who was the son of the enemy king. Now, stop there for a minute. Does this sound familiar? Well, it should. David befriends the son of a king. Remember Jonathan a little while back? The son of a king, King Saul, David's best friend. David now does the 180 and he goes and he befriends the son of the enemy king. Can't write stuff like that, you know, it is true. But look what happens. Achish and David become very close over more than a year together, and in time, Achish vouches for David. Would you agree that a person's character is determined by the company you keep? I think it is. So, what does it mean that a high-ranking pagan likes David? Achish is saying, I find no fault in him. He should find fault in him if he's a pagan and he's an Israelite. That's a pretty awkward situation David finds himself in. Achish is basically saying, yeah, he's not like one of those other Jews. He's more like us. He's a good guy. Well, whenever David and his men line up on the battlefield and the other Philistines, they aren't convinced. They haven't been with David over the last year. We still cannot forget this is the same David who years ago killed the Philistines' biggest and best warrior, Goliath. Now he wants to fight with his enemies against his own people. Something doesn't seem right here. So the Philistine commanders, they put the ixnay on it, as they say. They think David's some kind of a double agent, which we sort of wish he was. But I think David was really genuine when he wanted to fight against his own people. They think David just wants to get in good with them and then take them down in the middle of battle. Well, we just have reason to believe from the text that David's intentions probably were exactly as he led on to be. We're treading on very thin ice when ungodly people around you accept you as one of their own, as Achish did with David. Imagine how uncomfortable David must have been, though. From the perspective of the Philistines, he had too much God in him to be one of them. But from the perspective of the Israelites, he had too much of the Philistines in him to be one of them. So he's there sitting on the fence, and it's not a good place to be. Have you ever been uncomfortable in your faith? Maybe it's a situation where you don't seem to fit in with your old friends now that you're a Christian, but you don't want to let go of your previous ways either, because that's all that you're used to. And you don't want to quite give yourself completely over to God. Maybe you've even tried to find a church that isn't too Christian, isn't going to be too pushy, doesn't require too much of me. Maybe you want to find a church that is going to inspire you for the week, but not make you grow too much that you get too uncomfortable and lose your identity. Maybe you search around and you think, well, I've been with the Baptists, they're too loud. I've been with the Methodists, they're too quiet. Been with the Pentecostals, they're too wild. In the end, the problem isn't the denominations. Sometimes the problem is the believer. And when a person doesn't want to change, doesn't want to become more Christ-like, that's the underlying issue. Becoming a Christian is about changing and being transformed into a new creation. That's why we call it being born again. This is a new life. You take off the old man and you put on the new one. And I suggest that if you are uncomfortable in your faith, it means God's probably working in your life, which is a good thing. He's pushing you and prodding you to grow and mature into the believer that He wants you to be. And it feels uncomfortable when He does it, and even more uncomfortable when you resist Him. If you've ever felt like that, don't be ashamed, because that's exactly where David was here. For David, he got the reality check when he headed back home. He and his men were eagerly anticipating returning to their wives and children. After many days away, when they got there, they saw that their village had been attacked and burned by the enemies. Thankfully, none of their families were killed, but they were all taken away captive. I maintain this is exactly what David needed. I know it sounds crazy and harsh, but this is what we've been waiting for, the time when David hits rock bottom. Had he not been fearful, had he not been selfish, had he not isolated himself from other people, if he would have had the spiritual direction he should have had, then he wouldn't have led his men far from home into a battle he had no business in being in to begin with, and he would have been back in Ziklag protecting his own people. At that moment, David was the outcast. He wasn't accepted by his own people, and he wasn't accepted by the enemies, and he lost his whole family. When you are that far down and out, what do? Well, when you have no one else to rely on, you need to rely on God. And that's what David finally did. Did it ever occur to you that sometimes God lets things get so bad in your life so that you will rely on Him? That's what David did. He prayed to God. The Bible tells us David found strength in the Lord. Other translations say David strengthened himself in the Lord, which sort of suggests that it was up to David to initiate contact with God, because he refused to ask God his counsel all throughout these 4 chapters until it got this bad. Because God never forces himself upon us. And the reason is because God's ultimate goal is to be glorified. He is glorified when we humble ourselves and come before Him, but He would not be glorified by forcing us to act in a certain way. God urges us, pokes us, prods us, but He doesn't create us to be righteous robots. There would be no glory for Him if He did that. Sometimes we're like David and we get discouraged. We know how it feels. That feeling should allow us to empathize with other people who are feeling the exact same way. We never know if this will be the Sunday when a new visitor comes to church. Maybe a person's finally making an effort after a long struggle to get back to God. That's why the responsibility falls on every single person in every congregation to do your part to make church an inviting place for people to come. It isn't easy getting back into that routine of church, so deciding to do so oftentimes comes after a lot of struggle on their part. In other words, the church shouldn't make the experience any more difficult than it already is. Just as David was motivated by fear, I assume that most people who leave the church are motivated by fear also, or at least in part. So I want to close it out here by saying we need to assure other people in the church there's no need to fear when you are among the fellowship of believers. That's why I think a special service like this is very beneficial. For those of us who regularly attend, which I think is just about all of us here, it's nice to break away from the same routine, do something fun and different. Worship shouldn't be boring. It shouldn't be routine. It shouldn't be meaningless, because we are in the presence of the Almighty God. As for any visitors that might show up, it would be nice to be at a unique service like this, because people oftentimes bring in preconceived notions into any church. They have a certain idea what they think church is like, whether it's from past experience or maybe something that a friend told them. I doubt that many people would expect to have a church service like what we're doing right now. I mean, some people might come and say, "Are you allowed to do that?" Yeah, we're allowed to do this. You know, God's okay with it, I'm pretty sure. I checked with Him last night, you know. I hope it makes everyone here realize what is possible in regards to our worship of our Lord and Savior, and what's possible following God any way that He leads. Let's close this segment with a word of prayer.